What's up guys, welcome to Voicey here. This is your slightly bearded host, Captain Zach, and today's subreddit is r/NuclearRevenge, with a couple bonus stories from my personal favorite, r/Today I Fudged Up. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that bell to never miss an episode. This story's called Guns, Drugs, and an Overreaction. Intro. This took place about 9 to 10 years ago after a work-related back injury. I was on workers' comp and had a ton of free time and severe back pain. I decided to give marijuana a try for the first time in several years. I live in California and it was legal to use pot here with a doctor's recommendation. Right before all of this, I moved into a cheap little apartment in a not-so-great part of the city. I was naive and didn't realize that I was surrounded by meth addicts. I'm a musician and one of my neighbors was a fellow guitarist, Tim. We bonded pretty quickly over music and smoking pot. Things were going fine with my new place until our landlord, Cindy, got into a huge blowout with Tim over their illegal weed growing operation. Those idiots were growing hundreds of plants in the empty units without any permits or the consent of the owner. I don't know what really happened between them because the stories kept changing, but the fight was basically over money. Cindy was a woman in her 50s, but turned into a junior high school bully and set out to turn everyone against him. She first tried to get me on her side by giving me copious amounts of pot. When that didn't work, she started vandalizing my property and framed Tim for it. I became furious at him and confronted him about what was happening. We got into a huge shouting match and he called me, someone who has never used a drug in her life, unless you count pot, a meth head. His insult was especially ridiculous because he was an active meth user. After that incident, Tim would bang on my front door at all hours of the night, would yell racist slurs and insults at me, and even tried to kick my puppy. The final straw was when he ran up to me while I was outside and threw a huge bucket of hot water on me, my puppy, and my freaking phone. My dog was fine, and after placing my phone in a bag of uncooked rice, it was fine too. I, on the other hand, was beyond livid. The revenge. I talked to a friend, Chris, about what was going on at my place, and he concocted a plan. Since Cindy wanted me on her side, she gave me lots of information about Tim, including his cell number, which I gave to Chris. He started calling Tim several times a day. Chris would also start parking his car in visible places near the apartment complex. I began talking to the other neighbors and fed them information about mysterious cars and people watching the apartment complex. I knew the info would get back to Tim without me having to do very much. Tim became more and more paranoid and got to the point that he finally asked me, of all people, if I had noticed anything strange. I told him I had been seeing a strange car nearby with people just watching his apartment. He tried to give me a half-booty apology and asked me to let him know if I saw anything else. As a good neighbor, of course I agreed. He said he didn't know if it was the cops or a gang following and watching him. I shrugged as if I didn't know. After 2 weeks of Chris volunteering his free time to help me with my revenge, it all came to a head. One day, Tim hopped into his car and started driving. I was on the phone with Chris as he gave me the play-by-play. Tim tried to lose Chris by turning into a grocery store parking lot down the street. Chris jumped out of his car and fired a gun into the air several times and all hell broke loose. I had no idea he even carried a gun. Chris then chased Tim a few miles down the road until I was finally able to get him to stop and go home. I was worried he'd be arrested, so I called everything off. But it didn't matter at that point. Tim was now convinced that they were trying to kill him or somehow steal his pot-growing operation. A couple of days later, Cindy asked if I was interested in moving into Tim's apartment, which was slightly bigger than mine. I asked what was going on and she told me that Tim was moving out of state and that she was getting rid of their growing operation ASAP. By this time, I found out that she had been responsible for starting the fight between Tim and I. I was already looking for another place to live, so I declined and instead found the phone numbers for the complex owner and his son. I told them everything about the grow rooms. I also called the power company to let them know about the illegal power usage for the empty units. I'm not sure what happened with the power company, but when I called to inquire about an available apartment a few months later, I found out that the new landlord was one of my old neighbors. Cindy still lived in the complex, but was no longer in charge. My ending. I settled my workers' comp case a few weeks later and moved on. Although this was a very turbulent but short time in my life, it taught me many valuable lessons. Wow, this Redditor took everyone down. Cindy, Tim, I guess that's it, but still, that was both people. Would I say this is nuclear? Probably not, more like pro-revenge, but still pretty good. This story's called Screw Over Your Employees. Don't be too shocked when your dirty laundry starts catching up to you. So I need to keep this somewhat vague to maintain anonymity. And I wasn't there for all of it. This mostly happened to my friend who was one of the employees screwed over. But I did what I could to help my friend get revenge. Friend of mine was employed as a barista for a coffee shop with a couple of locations. Well, the owner turned out to be a grade A scumbag. Started paying the employees with bad checks, not giving them their tips if they were paid on credit card. Obviously, he couldn't steal their cash tips, not that he didn't try. Things along those lines. He was, of course, stealing from the business to fund his own lavish lifestyle. My friend was angry and quit shortly after this nonsense started. And of course, the business shortly went under. But if that's all that happened, this wouldn't fit in nuclear revenge. Now, my friend was out a few $1,000s. I'm not sure exactly how much, but enough that it was a serious hit to their budget. And they weren't the only ones. This creep was the classic con man, writing checks to cover the bad checks, all the delay tactics you ever see. Oh, the bank must have messed up, just redeposit it. And of course it comes back as a bad check a week or two later. Lots of shady stuff, but he was a good con man. All told, 8 people were getting screwed over to, I found out later, in excess of $20,000. So one afternoon, my friend is telling me this story, how he's so sick and tired of being conned by this creep, as well as everyone else. And here is where the nuclear revenge part comes into effect. I start digging into the business owner, all public record stuff, and some of it I learned from my friend or their coworkers. But started to learn a lot about this scumbag. He's got multiple felonies in his past. I'm all for giving people a second chance, but this guy wasn't that old and had racked up easily a half-dozen felonies. Why he wasn't still in jail is a topic for a much different forum. One of his convictions was being a felon in possession of a firearm. He was currently on probation for the above conviction. This is where things start getting interesting. A little more light digging and I come up with the name of his probation officer. When I sat and talked to my friend about what I had found out about his prior employer, 2 cycles of bounced checks was enough. He happened to mention that he had seen firearms in his apartment. They'd hung out together socially before things went completely pear-shaped. He'd used his girlfriend to purchase firearms since he was a prohibited person. Straw purchase, yet another felony. So now things get really interesting. I put my friend in contact with Scumbag's probation officer. Turns out, when you are out on probation, there's a lot of things you're not allowed to do. One of them is commit more felonies. This is an automatic revocation of your probation and will land your happy little butt back in jail. Oh, and knowingly passing bad checks in our state for the amount he was writing them for is a felony in and of itself. 8 employees, 3 payroll cycles before the business officially went belly up, 23 felony counts of passing a bad check, since my buddy bailed at 2 cycles, repeat offense of being a felon in possession of a firearm. As if that's not bad enough, when his probation officer came a knocking to check on these allegations, he also found drug paraphernalia and drugs sufficient to get him for possession of controlled substances with intent to distribute. Multiple different drugs. So multiple counts of that too. For those keeping score at home, if he was convicted of all these counts, he would be looking at roughly an additional 30 felonies. Easily enough to keep him in jail for a very long time. Now, if this were petty revenge, that's where things would have stopped. But no. You see, the state has this fund that all employers pay a tax into. It's a fund for those situations where the company goes out of business, writes bad checks for their employees, etc. And it's administered by the state labor board. So they pay out to cover the lost wages, but not the lost tips, of the employees. But the state is not benevolent in this. Oh no. You see, in order to attempt to recoup their losses, they can seize company assets. And in the case of a poorly set up company with no separation of assets between the company and the owner, they can also seize personal assets. Oh yes, that shiny new company truck that you're towing your shiny new boat with? Guess what, scumbag? They now belong to the state. Your bank accounts? Yep, those belong to the state now too. Now, surely you must be thinking, surely this is now pro-revenge, right? Oh no. You see, this scumbag messed with my friend, and I don't take kindly to that kind of nonsense. You see, my friend learned throughout this process that on top of all this, his employer was committing tax fraud/evasion. As far as the employees were concerned, they were all straight up W-4 employees, meaning he was withholding the correct taxes, payroll taxes, Medicare taxes, etc. Except he was reporting to the IRS that all of his employees were independent contractors and wasn't actually withholding any taxes at all. Taxes for the company? He was fudging those so badly they should have been sold as brownies. Unfortunately for Scumbag, a friend of a friend happened to work for the local IRS office, and after sitting with him over drinks one evening, found out that the IRS has a tip line for reporting tax evasion. And depending on how it's reported, well, turns out that the person reporting the tax evasion may actually get a small percentage as reward for turning in the tax sheet. So, on top of facing 30-some-odd felony charges, on top of having all his personal and company assets seized, Scumbag now has the IRS chasing after him. That, dear readers, is NuclearRevenge. I will update this as more developments come in. I can say that because this scumbag is such a scumbag, he is currently sitting in jail awaiting trial for domestic assault on his girlfriend. My friend and his coworkers have been interviewed by local police and the probation officer, as well as the IRS and the ATF for the straw purchases of the firearms through his girlfriend. My understanding is she's made a deal with the ATF to avoid charges for the straw purchases in exchange for her testimony against him. The district attorney and probation officer are waiting for him to be sentenced on the domestic violence charges before they go after him for all the other stuff. That way, he has to serve the sentences consecutively. As far as the federal charges, who knows when those will be filed. But my understanding is that no matter when he's charged, he'll have to serve the federal time after his state prison time, and won't get any credit for the time served in the state pen. Man, you gotta love when the dominoes start falling in these stories. They are so beautifully written at times. Gosh, they build it up so well, and then they just rack on all the ways they're just destroying this horrible person's life. Oh my god, that is so satisfying. Let me know in the comments below if you agree. This story's called, "Today I Fudged Up Buying My Son's Halloween Candy Away From Him. My kids go trick-or-treating. We live in a great candy neighborhood, so every year they come home with 100 to 200 pieces. When they're young, we tell them Santa brings every boy and girl a present on Halloween, and the more candy you leave him, the better present he'd leave in exchange. When the kids got old enough to realize Santa is a hoax, that's when we started paying in cash, 25 cents per piece. Did this with our oldest too, and it worked great. They'd give up about 3/4 of their candy and buy a toy. Our third child is 8 this year, so called us out on the Santa thing. We explained the new deal. He said, "So, then it's my money and I can buy whatever I want with it? A new skateboard even? Anything?" "You bet." "Swear?" "Yep." He goes and brings us all his candy, even every Kit Kat, his favorite. I was shocked, but he'd been saving up for a skateboard for a bit, so must have decided to go all in to push his savings over the edge. Getting all the sugar out of his room was the best case scenario. Easiest $31.75 I'd spent all week. Next day, I brought the candy to work. Then we went to Walmart after school and the kids ran to pick out their stuff. We met at the checkout. There's my son, who has raided the clearance aisle and found 200 Kit Kats for $10. I started to tell him to put it back, but he said, "What? You said I could buy whatever I wanted. You swore. I want my candy back then." His candy had already been eaten by my coworkers. And I did swear, and we put a lot of emphasis on the importance of keeping your word. So, my son has almost twice as much candy as he would have from just keeping his trick-or-treating. And a new skateboard. I don't know who's more angry, my wife that this plan backfired so horrifically, or his older brothers that they never thought to do this. Okay, first of all, That kid is insanely smart, okay? Did he read Art of the Deal? He read Art of the Deal. Trump, this is your new kid, okay? This story's called Today I Fudged Up by Building a Potato Gun and Seriously Underestimating Its Ability to Launch Potatoes Long Distances. So this didn't happen today, more like 16 or 17 years ago. But I just thought about it and wanted to post it since I think it's funny and potentially messed up. I was a kid and I had just learned that potato guns were a thing. So naturally I had to build one and see for myself. I bought some PVC pipe at the hardware store, rubber cement, a gas grill ignition source, propellant, I used hairspray in a can, and potatoes. Duh. It takes me like 2 days or so to make it and let the cement dry properly, and I was super excited to try it out. I could barely contain myself as I waited for it to fully dry. So when I was satisfied that the homemade potato bazooka wouldn't blow up in my face, I hopped on my dyno, remember those cool bikes? With a backpack full of potatoes and threw the giant white vegetable artillery cannon over my shoulder as I pedaled to the test site. A big open field about a mile from my house. I get there and no one is around. Perfect. I grab a potato from my bag and jam it into the front of the barrel. I modified a broomstick to get it all the way down the approximately 3-foot barrel. I grab the hairspray and spray what I consider to be enough into the gas chamber and quickly screw the back on. The bazooka is now loaded. Giddy with excitement, I hold it at an angle and pick a sector of the field to fire at. Now, there's roughly 200 yards between me and the fence, with a busy street right after the fence and a neighborhood beyond that. In my mind, I have more than enough room to test this thing, because I'm picturing it sailing maybe 100 to 125 yards tops. How wrong was I? I click the ignition, nothing. I click it again, nothing. I start to get disappointed and think maybe it isn't going to work. I click it a few more times and boom! The freaking potato launched from that thing so fast I couldn't believe what just happened. The recoil surprised me. I probably only weighed 100 pounds at the time, but before I could even admire what I had created, I realized that this freaking potato from hell is going to easily clear the fence 200 yards away and go into the neighborhood. It went so far that I couldn't even see where it would have potentially landed, and lost sight of it as it tore through the sky over some houses. Well, I panicked and felt like I just finished robbing a bank, and at that point, I had to make sure no one knew it was me in case it damaged something or hurt someone. I was a little kid, stop judging me so hard. So I hopped on my bike and pedaled home as fast as I could. I didn't tell anyone for weeks just in case it hit something. But I never heard or saw any news articles about a little kid being killed by a random potato from the sky, so I assumed that it must have been fairly uneventful wherever it really did land. Nothing too bad, but it was a cute little story about a kid launching a potato so far he lost sight of it. Be careful launching potatoes. I've had a bad experience with that before. Never again. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that bell to never miss an episode.